Good evening, everyone. Um, Welcome to the THF Talk series, organized in tandem with the Himalayan Fellowship for Creative Practitioners, a unique fellowship program launched by FICA in collaboration with Royal Enfield as a new initiative for the Himalayan belt. We launched it last year, and through this platform, we aim to support and empower creative practitioners, individuals, and collectives working at the intersection of ecology and cultural knowledge in the Western and Eastern Himalayan region. The year-long fellowship will support selected projects with a grant amount of up to 3 lakhs each towards the development of their projects. And we look forward to building a structured program with them, entailing components of mentorship and interactive sessions with resource persons, workshops, and eventually an exhibition platform. We were thrilled to announce our first cohort of fellows last year, and we're excited to be working with them for the year ahead as well. The THF Talk series was started with the intention of presenting a public-facing forum for the fellowship, bringing together key resource persons, ideas and bodies of work that would speak to our positionality with the grant, but also to widen our understanding of the Himalayan region. Co-conceptualized with our fellowship consultants, Dr. Monisha Ahmed and Mary Therese Kulkalang, this talk series is a way for us to activate and think with new ways of reading the region, its possibilities, and new lenses of inquiry. As some of you may remember, we hosted our inaugural talk in the series with Professor Ganesh Devi. His talk was titled The Story of Language and the Language of Story. And Professor Devi had reflected on his extensive research encompassing the evolution of languages and the how and why of why language needs to be seen as a narrative of the universe. He shared his readings of folk stories, he emphasized their importance, and also spoke about the difficulties relating to documentation. So it was a very interesting talk. And today we are thrilled to be welcoming acclaimed writer Stephen Alter for the second event of the talk series. To introduce our speaker for the day, Stephen Alter is the author of more than 20 books of fiction and nonfiction. His recent novel, Birdwatching, received the 2023 Green Book of the Year award at the Green Literature Festival, Bengaluru. Wild Himalaya, A Natural History of the Greatest Mountain Range on Earth, published by Alice in 2019, received the 2020 Banff Mountain Book Award in the Mountain Environment and Natural History category, and the 2021 Keku Nauroji Award for Himalayan Literature. Educated at Woodstock School and Wesleyan University, Alter has taught at the American University in Cairo, Egypt, where he was the director of the writing program for 7 years. Following this, he was a writer in residence at MIT for 10 years. And among the honors that he has received are fellowships from the Guggenheim Foundation, the Fulbright Program, the East-West Center in Hawaii, and the Banff Center for Mountain Culture. His latest nonfiction book is The Cobra's Gaze, Exploring India's Wild Heritage. As a writer of fiction and nonfiction, Stephen Halter has focused much of his attention on the Himalayan region, where he was born and raised and where he continues to live and write in Mussoorie, Uttarakhand. In today's talk, titled The Himalaya as a Source of Inspiration, he will discuss the many ways in which Himalayan landscapes and the biodiversity they support can serve as inspiration for creative expression in different genres. He will explore the intersection of mythology, folklore, and scientific narratives that often coincide to provide multi-layered perceptions of mountains, valleys, and rivers. All of this will be discussed in the context of ecological degradation and environment crisis, including the effects of climate change. This talk comes at an opportune moment, especially as within creative practices, we continue to think with and against ideas of representation. We persist in trying to find ways of articulating our relationship to modes of inspiration, and we continue to pursue the otherwise uphill challenge of dialoguing with the many nuances of a geography like the Himalayas. So before I hand it over to our speaker, a few housekeeping requests. Please keep your mic off and on mute. We will be taking questions after the talk, which you're free to type in the chat box during the talk as well. Or you can also use the raise hand option only when we open the floor for questions. So thank you all for coming, and we look forward to this. Over to you, Stephen.
Great. Well, thank you, Anna. It's a real pleasure to be here, and a delight to be part of your Himalayan Fellows Program and FICA's activities. I'm I'll confess that I'm not in the Himalaya right now. I'm sitting in Scotland, but the time zones are compatible in some ways. So I hope I can take you to the Himalaya in these short remarks. I have a series of images that I'm going to project, and I'm going to ask Anna in just a moment to put those up on the screen, and I'll be speaking to those and over those. And then once we finish, I'll come back in person. I think we can get started, and then I can explain as I go along. Great. I think we're on the slideshow now, and I can get started. Today, what I thought I would do is, because each of the fellows is working in different genres of art and cultural interpretation, that I talk a little bit about the way I look at the Himalaya as a source of inspiration, primarily as a writer, but I hope that some of the things I say may have some resonance for each of you in different genres and different forms of art and cultural expression. The mountains have always been a part of my life, and I have drawn inspiration from them since childhood. This image that we're starting with is from Nepal. It's Mount Everest on the left there at sunrise, taken from Kalapatra, a moment that for me was, of course, extremely inspiring and moving on many levels. So there are many images that we hold with us from the Himalaya that have a lot of personal significance, but also cultural significance on a larger level. And that's really what I'll be talking about. Next. The next image, please.
Stephen hasn't moved. I think.
Sorry?
No, it hasn't
Has the
moved.
slide changed? Okay, one second.
No, it's
I'll
not
just
changing.
reshare
Sorry,
my
I think
screen.
it's.
One second.
Yeah, it may need to go into the full screen mode. Yes, now we've shifted,
Okay,
and I think
great.
we're now good to go. Very briefly, what I'll be talking about today is drawn from several of my books that focus on the Himalayan region. Two that I published some years ago. One is called Sacred Waters, which was a series of journeys to the sources of the Ganga in Uttarakhand, and then Becoming a Mountain, which is a personal memoir about journeys to approaching Nanda Devi, but also to Kailash and other journeys through the mountains, but also very much a personal journey. Next. I'll also be drawing from Wild Himalaya primarily, which was a book that came out in 2019 and covered as best I could the whole range of the Himalaya with a series of journeys that I took in the Indian Himalaya, Nepal, Bhutan, and the little corner of Pakistan where the Himalaya extend at the western region. I also will draw on a few thoughts from my most recent book, The Cobra's Gaze, which is really about wildlife throughout India, but has elements of the Himalaya too. Next. When we look at the Himalaya, as we do here at Quarry Pass, one of the most spectacular panoramas in the Himalaya, in Uttarakhand, we look at the mountains and we think of them as something eternal, immutable, unchanging. And yet, at the same time, they are a living landscape. And that's something that I think we must always remember. We think of them as these eternal snow mountains that, in a sense, inspire us to think about divinity, sacred spaces, and certainly they evoke that sense. But they are very much a living landscape and a changing landscape. And one of the important things to remember about the Himalaya is that it is a dynamic landscape, something that is not static in any ways. The other thing that has always fascinated me about the Himalaya is the way in which we as human beings interpret, uh, explore, and venerate these spaces. If you see on the right-hand side of this picture, someone has built a cairn of rocks that look out upon those mountains. And in a sense, that cairn has taken that enormous mountain off there in the distance and brought it to a human scale here so that we appreciate the mountains in the distance, but we also venerate this shrine that has been built right here at the spot where we are standing. Next, please. When we look at a snow peak like this, Nilkant in Garhwal, this is part of that view that we saw from the Quarry Pass. We have a sense of the enormous altitude of these mountains, the scale that we in ourselves, we as someone observing them, we feel extremely small and insignificant compared to these enormous mountains. And we also see everything that surrounds them, like the clouds, the land in the foreground. And all of this becomes part of our perception and something that we try to incorporate into our own interpretation of these peaks, the stories we tell about these mountains. Next, please. And you can see here how these stones cairns are, again, just like that cairn at Quarry Pass, are a gesture, a human gesture towards those mountains, just as the mountain in the image preceding this had the clouds wrapped around it. Someone here on this stone, which is actually on the pilgrimage route around Mount Kailash, has wrapped a white scarf. And we are doing this constantly, sometimes physically, but often in our imaginations, interpreting, venerating these high mountains. Similarly, this cairn here in the Gochila Valley in Sikkim on the approach to Kanchenjunga also takes those mountains and brings it down to our scale so that we can experience them more immediately. And at the same time, it reflects the enormity of those mountains and their physical stature in that way. Next, please. There are so many mountains in the Himalaya that are considered sacred. And that's something that has fascinated me for years in the sense is, why is a mountain considered sacred? How do we, in a sense, express that sanctity? This is, of course, Nanda Devi, seen from Auli in Uttarakhand, perhaps one of the most sacred mountains in India, in the Himalayan range. The goddess Nanda Devi is associated with the mountain Nanda Devi, and there's an enormous amount of mythology. There's an enormous amount of spiritual lore and religious practice that is associated with this mountain. But I think that one of the interesting things about peaks in the Himalaya is the way in which there are different layers of narrative, and I'll be talking about that as well. There is, of course, the mythological and spiritual layer of narrative or storytelling, but here also we have stories of mountaineering. This is the highest peak within the boundaries of India. So there are many, many climbers attempted to climb this peak. And over the years, it was one of the prime mountaineering destinations in the Himalaya. But at the same time, it's also geologically and ecologically a very important site the Nanda Devi Sanctuary, which lies at the foot of the mountain, is a small valley that is very, very difficult to reach and almost inaccessible. And the fact that that remained protected and inviolate for so many years is also part of the story. There's also a political story attached to Nanda Devi where the CIA and the Intelligence Bureau during the Cold War planted a listening device on the top of the mountain in order to monitor nuclear tests in China. So each of these layers of story contribute to the lore of this mountain. And as a writer, that's what fascinates me, is the way in which there are so many different narratives attached to it. Next, please. This is again one of the most sacred mountains in the Himalaya. This is Kanchenjunga, seen from the Gochila Valley to the southwest. Kanchenjunga, the name comes from the 5 treasures of the snow, and each of its multiple summits has a certain significance, both for Buddhists and for Hindus. It's a peak that the Chogyal of Sikkim refused to allow mountaineers to climb for many years, and ultimately the British persuaded him to let mountaineers go on the condition that they did not stand on the summit. So they were to stop 6 feet short of the summit. So there's that mountaineering lore that is tied up with the spiritual lore as well, as I explained with Nanda Devi. Next, please. Those high summits, of course, are what we think of when we think of the Himalaya first. But it's very important to understand that the mountains themselves are a living landscape, and there is much more to a mountain than just its summit. The slopes below that mountain are full of life. Here we have Brahmkamal flowers and sedum growing on the lower slopes of actually the ridges leading up to Trishul, another sacred peak associated with Nanda Devi. And you can also see, when I spoke about the dynamic landscape, you can see this rockfall that these plants are growing out of is the debris from the erosion and the uplift that actually created the mountain. So not only is it dynamic in a biological sense, it is geologically also a dynamic landscape. Next, please. It is a huge reservoir of biodiversity. The Himalaya, throughout the range, contain a vast number of endemic as well as common species, like the blue poppy here in the upper left-hand corner, one of the most spectacular flowers in the Himalaya, the yellow and black grosbeak, again, a spectacular bird that we have in the Himalaya, the oak leaf butterfly in the lower Himalaya, and then the bharal or blue sheep that we have in the high mountains. Each of these species has a story attached to it. And that story will be a scientific story, but it will also have folklore. It may also have stories that come from our own personal experiences. And so as a writer, when I'm traveling through the mountains, encountering each of these different aspects of that Himalayan landscape, I am collecting stories, anecdotes, observations about each of these different species to be able to weave them together into the larger narrative, which in a sense is a part of the biography of the Himalaya or the life story of these mountains. Next, please. I often say that many of my books were written with my feet. I write with my feet, and I mean that literally, because for me, many of the stories that I tell, many of the journeys that I've taken through the mountains have been on foot. There is no better way to experience the landscape. There's no better way to understand the different levels of vegetation that occur at different altitudes in the Himalaya, and to encounter so many of the different myths and stories from folklore that are associated with different locations along these paths. I like to say that almost every rock certainly in Uttarakhand, and every bend in the road has a story attached to it. So as a writer, when I'm walking through this landscape, the first draft of whatever I write is really coming from that trek that I'm taking there. This is along the path to a very interesting small little lake called Rupkund in Garhwal, which has an enormous number of stories and myths attached to it. But the approach to that along this path during the monsoon with these spectacular flowers along the way, that also is part of the story, not the mythological story, but perhaps the botanical story that runs parallel to that. Next, please. And as you walk through the mountains, you also become aware of the creation story of the Himalaya, the tectonic collision of continents that push these mountains almost 9 kilometers up into the sky. And as you trek through these mountains, as I travel from one place to another, as I leave the tree line behind and move up to the snow line, beyond which there's very little life, I can see in the shape of those rocks, the way in which they have buckled and twisted and contorted through the enormous forces that collided and made these mountains come together and push up. You can read that story in the landscape itself. And the geological story, I often say that as a creation story, there's nothing that can match the creation of the Himalaya, because it is so enormous. It takes so much, it covers such a span of time, and it is awe-inspiring when you see peaks like this that have been thrust up out of the crust of the earth through the force of um, um, tectonic collision in the way that all of the Himalaya have been formed, but particularly when you get up to these high levels, the erosion exposes the contours of the mountain, and you can actually read that creation story right there in the rocks. Next, please. If you look at a map of the Himalaya, it's very important. And now most of you as Himalayan fellows, I don't have to explain this to you, but many people think of the Himalaya simply as a wall at the north side of India, just going straight across the top. But it's very important to realize several key aspects of the Himalaya. It is actually an arc, and it's an arc that begins at a northernmost point in Ladakh and near Nanga Parbat, which is the highest peak to the west in the Himalaya. And then that arc moves down in a curve into Nepal in central India, and then all the way across to Arunachal Pradesh. Many people forget, actually, that the latitude of Mount Everest, which you can see there in the center, or the right center of this map, is the latitude is actually lower or farther south than Delhi. And this is very important to understand for several reasons. One is because of the effects of climate change. The latitude of these high peaks makes them particularly vulnerable to changes in temperature. It also gives you a sense of why there is so much more biodiversity in the eastern range of the Himalaya as against the western range. Ladakh has wonderful biodiversity, but far fewer species than Arunachal Pradesh, in the east. And the main reason for that is the latitude as well as the humidity and the amount of water that is available for those forests to thrive and the species that thrive in those forests. So the map is very important to, I think, visualize these mountains. The Himalaya are not uniform. As I said, they're not static, but they change as you move from west to east. And there are significant changes as you make that progression. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a few minutes. Next, please. The one thing I meant to say with that map, but I can say it with this image, is that we often think of the Himalaya as simply mountains, but it is equally important and perhaps more important to understand that they are a source of rivers. There are thousands of rivers that flow out of the Himalaya, and that moisture which flows out into the plains of North India, as well as flowing out into southeastern China, is of vital importance to people that live far out of sight of these mountains. So we must not forget that the rivers themselves are as important as these summits. And this again is Mount Everest with the Solukhumbu Valley, the Khumbu Icefall, and the Khumbu Glacier. And the Himalaya are often referred to as the third pole, or sometimes the water towers of Asia. And the reason for that is that they are the largest, the Himalaya represents the largest accumulation of ice anywhere on Earth after Antarctica and the North Pole. So the two polar regions, of course, have enormous amount of ice, and the Himalaya have the third most amount of frozen moisture anywhere on Earth. And that, of course, is the source of these rivers. That moisture is frozen in the snowfields high up on the mountains, and then it is collected and stored in the glaciers, just as you can see in this Solukhumbu Valley, the Khumbu Glacier here, as it comes down off the mountain. And then as it melts, it creates these glacial ponds here, and then slowly releases that moisture into the rivers that then flow out of the mountain. So it's very important to think of these mountains as a reservoir of frozen moisture that is stored for being released during the rest of the year, and frankly, to be released over centuries in time. Next, please. Because of climate change, because of warming that is occurring not just in the past few years since we've been talking about climate change, but over the last few centuries, many of these glaciers are receding. And the glaciers, as you walk through the Himalaya and you see many of the glaciers, you see evidence of where those glaciers were and where they are now. And you can very easily understand how they are being depleted. That reservoir of moisture is being reduced as we speak. This is one of the most dramatic examples that I have encountered. This is the Gangapurna Glacier in central Nepal, near Manang. You can see the Gangapurna Peak up in the background there, and it has this ice fall, which is sort of a vertical glacier coming down there. But 60 years ago, that glacier extended to where you can now see this body of water. And you can see the moraine where the ice used to be in the background there. And so over the last 60 years, this ice has retreated several kilometers up into the mountains. Next, please. These are images that geologist and glaciologist Tony Hagen put together, and then others have reinterpreted, some using digital technology and modeling. But basically, it can give you a sense of how that Gangapurna glacier has changed over time. The 1850 obviously is not a photograph, but it is a digital model of what the glacier must have been like at that time. And then you can see 1950, 100 years later, how it had begun to recede there. And then another simply 50 years, half a century later, you can see what it was like in 2005. So there's no denying the fact that these glaciers are retreating. Glaciers do retreat, they advance as well. Some glaciers are advancing in the Himalaya, very few, but the vast majority are retreating and disappearing. And once they disappear, then the source of that water obviously disappears as well. Next, please. Glaciers and the melting of glaciers has enormous consequences for people in the Himalaya and beyond. In 2013, many of you will remember, there was a glacial lake outburst above Kedarnath in Uttarakhand. You can see the devastation that it left here around the temple, the main temple at Kedarnath. Essentially, what happened was that the glaciers further up in the mountains had melted to a point where there were these large ponds of water held back by very fragile ice dams, which in and of themselves, they were melting as well. And when there was an enormous amount of water in a deluge in 2013 during the monsoon, the water level rose to such a level that it burst that ice dam. And then, of course, it rushed down the slope, carrying with it all of the debris, these enormous boulders that were carried with it. Next, please. You can see how the Ganga itself was swollen at that time. These are images taken from news reports from 2013. You can see how it rose right up to the level of the bridge here at Rudraprayag, a terrifying flood of water. Next, please. Now, water can be a destructive force, as you see in those images of Kedarnath. It can wipe out entire valleys, entire settlements. And there's a lot that we can talk about in terms of the human response to catastrophes like that. But water also is a creative force. It's sometimes a very placid and calming presence in the mountains. This is a small pond, not a glacial pond, just a natural pond at a place called Chitrakanta above Auli, looking out at Nanda Devi again at the right and Dhunagiri Peak to the left. So you can find these very idyllic little water bodies in the Himalaya, which have none of the destructive force of those glacial ponds. Next, please. And as we all know that the water is, of course, a source of life. And here in the Zanskar Valley in Ladakh, you can see how a farmer has been able to channel some of the water from the Zanskar River or from a spring near the Zanskar River onto a set of fields. And here within the midst of this absolutely arid landscape, you have this brilliant green of fields and trees, so that the water as a presence is, in a sense, it's a catalyst for life. And again, this idea that the Himalaya are an enormous reservoir of water, which then, in a sense, supports what I like to think of as an enormous reservoir of life and biodiversity. Next, please. the time of year, certainly in my home in Mussoorie, when we are most aware of water bringing life out of the land is the monsoon, when the trees, the ground, everything around us is covered in moss, ferns, ground orchids, all sorts of species of monsoon plants that burst forth as soon as the rain begins to fall. And you can see here on this Banj oak the way in which the ferns and polypods and the moss have simply colonized this entire tree. So there is a sort of layer of life on a living tree, of course. And when you are there in the mountains during the during the monsoon in the Himalaya, you are aware of the fact that life is just absolutely exploding around you. And it becomes a sense of just the fecundity, the fertility of this landscape and how it changes from one season to the next. Next, please. I like to think of the water and the rocks as the blood and bones of the mountains. That's a somewhat clumsy metaphor, but I think it'll give you the idea of the way in which water and rock work together to reshape, to change this landscape. This is a seasonal waterfall near Ukimut in Garhwal, and I like to show this picture because of the way in which you have the flowing water, which is coming down over the lip of this waterfall and splashing against the rocks. And that is carving the rocks slowly, inexorably over time, shaping, polishing, and restructuring the mountains in many ways. Water, just as you saw it, Kedarnath, it can happen all at once, or it can happen slowly over time. But water is something that definitely changes the face of the mountain. And then at the same time, you can see these rocks, this foliated gneiss, hard volcanic rock that is part of this strata of the Himalaya. And you can see how they are flowing upwards. The veins of crystallized rock that look almost as if they are flowing in one direction while the water is flowing in the other. And that is really one of the underlying forces in the Himalaya that is constantly changing the face of this landscape. Next, please. Water, just like mountains, is often revered, venerated, and considered sacred throughout the Himalaya by people of all faiths, particularly Buddhists and Hindus. And just as we venerate a mountain like Nanda Devi, we venerate the source of springs and we attach stories to them. We have mythological narratives that interpret the source of many rivers, the Ganga in particular, but often many other smaller streams. The idea of the Gaumuk, the sacred cow out of which the river flows, is here. Gaumuk Glacier in Garhwal, of course, is a wall of ice out of which the sacred water flows. But this is a small spring at Muktinath in Nepal, which also has this particular image. Interestingly, this image, though it's a predominantly Hindu story or myth, was in a Buddhist temple and obviously has been wrapped in these scarves. So we think of water as a sacred substance, just as we think of mountains as being sacred. Next, please. And we venerate these rivers, these water bodies, at different points along their course. But one of the most sacred points in the flow of a river is a confluence with another stream. This confluence is at Rudraprayag, again in Uttarakhand, where the Mandakini River, which flows down from Kedarnath, joins the Alaknanda that comes from Badrinath. And at that point where the two streams meet is considered a particularly sacred site. This is one of my favorite spots in Uttarakhand, looking across at this temple in Rudraprayag. And at night, when you cannot see anything except perhaps a sort of a shadowy movement of the river itself, the priests will carry the arti down these steps to the confluence itself and make a gesture to this force of nature, to these dramatic phenomena which are so much a part of a Himalayan landscape. By the way, this you can see in the background, there's a bridge which was washed away it's an old colonial era bridge that was washed away in 2013 because the water came up so high. But that bridge also has stories is associated with Jim Corbett's man-eating leopard of Rudraprayag. He sat waiting for the man-eating leopard on the top of that pylon to the right, hoping to rid the people of Rudraprayag of this man-eating leopard. So there is this colonial lore also at the same time as we have these mythological narratives. And then, of course, at the heart of it is the geological narrative of how these mountains pushed up as the rivers flowed through them and carved their course to the plains and then ultimately to the sea. Next, please. The source of the Ganga at Gangotri is one of the most dramatic sites certainly in Uttarakhand. We have the Bhagirathi peaks in the background that overlook the Gaumukh glacier below. And the Bhagirathi peaks, again, like Nanda Devi, have many, many layers of narrative attached to them. They are named after King Bhagirath, who was a mythological figure who did hundreds of years of austerities or tapasya in order to persuade Ganga to come down from heaven to earth. And so in recognition of his austerities, these peaks are called the Bhagirathi peaks at the source of the Ganga. Next, please. But as dramatic as those peaks are the valleys at their foot. This is the Jarganga Valley, just maybe about 20 kilometers south of the foot of the Bhagirathi peaks, where this river, the Jarganga, joins the Bhagirathi branch of the Ganga. And what I find most dramatic here is the way in which those mountains, the rocks, were pushing upward through the force of the continental collision that occurred. And that river was there beforehand. And that river has sort of sawed its path through these cliffs. So you can imagine how these rocks lifted upwards and the river held its course and literally cut through these layers and layers of rock. This is at a place called Lanka, about 10 kilometers short of Gangotri. There's a bridge over this. Earlier pilgrims would have to walk all the way down to the bottom and then all the way back up the other side. Now there's a concrete bridge which takes you across in seconds. But I always tell people, as you're going across that bridge, stop for a minute and look over and see what dramatic geology there is in this part of the mountains, because it reflects those tremendous forces of nature. Again, that combination of water and rock that shapes and lies at the core of these mountains. Next, please. The source of the Ganga, or the descent of the Ganga, as a mythological story, is something that is not confined to Uttarakhand. In fact, if you go 2,000 kilometers south of Gangotri, more than 2,000 kilometers south of Gangotri, to the beach on the eastern coast of the subcontinent in Tamil Nadu at Mahabalipuram, you find this spectacular frieze that has been carved out of the rocks right near the shore of the ocean. And for many years, people spoke of this as Arjuna's penance, and it had stories linked to the Mahabharata. But scholars have reinterpreted it, and most agree that it is actually a depiction of the descent of the Ganga. If you look at the top of that middle channel to the left, you can see a man with his arms raised doing tapasya, and that is King Bhagirath. And the Ganga then comes down from heaven, and through this channel that has been carved and ornamented with different figures, the monsoon rain will flow just as Ganga flowed down to earth. And all of the deities have gathered to watch this spectacular, momentous event as Ganga descends from heaven. And what fascinates me as I look at this is not just the mythological story, but also the fact that it is deities and it is wildlife that come to venerate the Ganga. In that channel, you can see the Nagarajas, the cobra deities that are there receiving the Ganga. You see the elephants that are associated with moisture and water dominating the scene on the right-hand side. And just below the elephant's tusks, you can see a cat who is also doing tapasya, imitating King Bhagirath. It's a sort of mischievous element that the sculptors introduced into this. But the idea that all of nature and all of divinity comes together to celebrate the descent of the Ganga is really a remarkable well, metaphorically, it's remarkable in the sense of the way in which we look at nature and we look at the earth around us, but also the way in which we receive inspiration, and our imaginations are sparked by those dramatic landscapes of the Himalaya. And the fact that this is 2,000 kilometers away, the sculptors probably never saw the Himalaya. The people that then visited this site probably never saw the Himalaya, and yet the Himalaya have significance here on the coast of Tamil Nadu. Next, please. As I said, the Himalaya are a source of many, many rivers, but perhaps the most sacred source after Gangotri, or perhaps preceding Gangotri, depending on how you interpret it, is Lake Mansarovar and the watershed surrounding Mount Kailash, which you can see in the upper right-hand corner. You can see the two water bodies. Lake Mansarovar is on the right, Rakshasthal is on the left, and Mount Kailash is just above that. Mount Kailash actually lies in the Trans-Himalayan region beyond, but this is the source of four significant rivers of South Asia. Of course, the Indus starts all within about a 50-kilometer radius. The Indus starts here and then flows westward, then takes a curve around Nanga Parbat, and then flows into what is now Pakistan and out into the Arabian Sea. You have the Sutlej, which also begins close there, cuts through the mountains, and then also goes on to join the Indus. You have the Kaligandaki River, which also, the Karnali, which starts in that same region and again cuts through the mountains and joins the Ganga in the plains of Bihar. And then, of course, the Sangpo, which flows eastwards, just like the Indus, and then ultimately takes a turn and heads south and becomes the Brahmaputra. So all of these rivers, the Indus and the Brahmaputra, begin within 50 kilometers of each other and flow in opposite directions, and they form the parentheses within which the Himalaya, the true Himalaya, are found. So it is very much a hydrological story as well that needs to be told in the context of these mountains. Next, please. I spoke of the Sangpo, and anyone who has seen the Brahmaputra, the Siang, as it comes out of the mountains of Arunachal Pradesh, and then the Brahmaputra as it flows through the Assam Valley and then on into the Delta, you know how enormous it is. It can take often a couple of hours to cross that river at some of its widest points. And yet here in Tibet, our vehicles, as we were on pilgrimage to Kailash, our vehicles were able to drive across. This is the Sangpo in Tibet. I was even able at a certain point to roll up my pant legs and wade across the river at this point. So you get a sense of how, first of all, how enormous this river is in terms of its length, but also how so many other rivers have contributed to its flow. And ultimately, when it leaves the mountains, it is this literally a flowing ocean of water there. Next, please. Kailash is often referred to as the most sacred mountain in the Himalaya. Its iconic shape is recognizable to anyone who has seen calendar images in tea shops or temples. It is this beautiful mountain that rises to a single summit, and the striations on its source are interpreted through many different stories, not just Hindu and Buddhist mythology, but also Bon mythology, Bon being the older tradition, an animistic tradition that was there before Buddhism came to Tibet. And that groove down the center of that mountain is said to be a scar when a Bon shaman was knocked from the top of the mountain and his damru actually fell down there. There are many, many other stories attached to the physical features of that mountain. The peak in the foreground is often referred to as Nandi Parvat. Of course, in Hindu mythology, Lord Shiv sits in meditation at Kailash, and Nandi the bull is in front of him. And then you can see in the foreground, someone has built this small cairn of rocks, another shrine that brings it down to our scale and makes it sort of accessible to us. Next, please. And just as we have the source of the Ganga being interpreted on the shores of Tamil Nadu, we have Mount Kailash interpreted at Ellora in this spectacular temple, the Kailash temple at Ellora, which has been carved out of the rock. It wasn't constructed. It was rather the stonemasons took, or rather the carvers took the rock away, and what was left became the structure. And if you look at it carefully, you can see the striations that you saw on Mount Kailash are represented here. All of the myths, all of the stories and legends that are associated with this mountain are depicted in the carved friezes and iconography, the idols that are within this temple. And again, here we are 1,500 kilometers away from Kailash itself. And here in the imagination of these stone carvers in what is now Maharashtra, we have this mountain depicted in its mythological form. And Kailash gives its shape to so many temples throughout India. It is that shape of the mountain that is depicted with these striations, these horizontal lines across the face of that peak. Next, please. This is again back at Kailash. This is looking at the north side of the mountain. I won't go into too much detail on it, but when I was traveling there, I was accompanying a group of pilgrims from Maharashtra and from Gujarat. That was the only way I could travel to Kailash, was to attach myself to that group. And it was fascinating to listen to their stories, their interpretation of what this mountain represents. If you look at the top of the mountain, you can see the cornice of ice, which is created by the wind blowing the ice crystals over the top of the mountain, and then they solidify and form that beautiful shape at the top. For the pilgrims, that was the hood of the Sheshnag that shields Lord Shiv in his meditation. And they certainly told those stories to me. The striation, those lines, horizontal lines across the face of the mountain, were said to be the ropes, were the grooves that were cut into the face of the mountain when Ravan lifted Kailash up and tried to take it to Lanka. Again, all sorts of stories associated with that mythology. But I cannot look at that mountain now without recalling those stories that I was told by pilgrims from 2,000 kilometers away who came here and recognized the narratives that they had heard in the geography and physical features of this particular mountain. Next, please. Human beings have been interpreting the landscape, interpreting nature for thousands of years in the Himalaya. Here in Ladakh, this is along a small tributary of the Indus. We have a rock that is covered with petroglyphs from, we're not sure how long ago. It could be 5,000 years. It could even be as much as 7,000 years. But these were carved by hunter-gatherers who entered the Himalaya after the last ice age ended around 10,000 years ago. And they came in pursuit of animals that they hunted, and they carved their features onto these rocks. Next, please. You can see here's another rock in which all of the animals appear, from yaks to wild sheep to snow leopards and other creatures that are depicted in this. I like to think of these as some of the first field guides to Himalayan mammals. These hunter-gatherers left a record of the animals they hunted. They probably told stories about each of these animals that they etched into the surface of these rocks. There may even have been a spiritual component to that gesture that they made on the face of these rocks, perhaps offering prayers for an abundance of creatures like this that they could hunt and then feed on. Next, please. We can recognize so many species that are there in those petroglyphs from thousands of years ago. They still exist here. One of my favorite images, again along the Kyamerchu east of Leh, is this rock lizard in the rocks. You can see it in the image to the left. It's immediately recognizable. And this photograph that I took not more than about 100 meters away from it has a rock lizard sunning itself on the same rock formation itself. So the creatures that we see in the stories that are carved into those rocks, those are living creatures that we can encounter today. Next. I'll just show you a sequence of images that will give you a sense of the presence of these creatures. This, if you look at it, is a wild sheep or an urial with its curved horns. Next, please. And here is the urial, again photographed in Ladakh. Immediately recognizable. You can see the curve of its horns. A beautiful creature, absolutely perfectly adapted to this environment. The pelage has the colors, those wonderful tans and ochres and grays of the Ladakh landscape. And it is a living evidence of the images that were carved on the rocks. Next, please. Many of these images appear to be naive, perhaps even crude, and yet it's very important to recognize that, in fact, they are extremely accurate. The people that carved these petroglyphs into the face of the rocks in Ladakh observed these creatures firsthand. They knew what they looked like, and they represented them with as much accuracy as they could. You can see this ibex. The horns, of course, are immediately recognizable, but look at the beard under its chin. Look at the placement of the ear behind the horns. Look at the length of the tail. Look at the shape of the body. Next, please. And here is the ibex itself again in Ladakh. You can see where the beard is, look where the ears are, look at the tail and the shape of its body. Those early artists were not just creating fanciful images, they were giving us an accurate record of this particular species, its morphology, as well as its behavior. And it's important for us as naturalists today to be able to look at those images and recognize that these were images carved in stone long before any of these creatures had been given the Latin names that we use today, or the descriptions that zoologists have created and adapted and added to over so many years. 5,000 years ago, someone was looking at that same animal and was inspired to create that image on the face of a rock. Next, please. And here is an animal you may recognize. Look at the spots, look at the long tail. It is a snow leopard. And this was actually in the Zanskar Valley, a petroglyph sort of off on its own, easily recognizable as a snow leopard. Next, please. And not far from where I saw that, I found this snow leopard. If you can see it, it may take you a few moments to find the snow leopard, but if you look there, it's like one of those magic eye puzzles that once you see it, it's obvious. At about 12 o'clock, about a third of the way down from the top of the image, you can see the snow leopard, yes, thank you, walking across the snowfield there. Next. And here we see the same animal through a spotting scope. And you can see, again, this wonderful pelage that reflects the colors, the nuances of that landscape. An animal that has adapted to extremely high altitudes, well above 4,000 meters above sea level, and hunts the ibex and the urial in that environment. Next, please. Going to the eastern extreme again, we see, of course, a very, very different landscape. And this is just one example of the biodiversity that we find in places like Sikkim and Arunachal Pradesh, the wonderful variety of rhododendron species. In Mussoorie, we have really just one species, actually two species of rhododendrons in the part of the Himalaya where I live. And then as you move down that arc that I described earlier and come to this eastern part of the Himalaya, you end up with 30 or 40 different species of rhododendrons. Next, please. Here is a lemon-colored rhododendron, very different from the pink ones or the bright red rhododendron arboreum that we have. Next, please. And this is an epiphytic rhododendron, which has its roots up in the bark of a giant oak or birch tree. I'm not sure which it was in this case, but it has these lovely white flowers. So the biodiversity just is exponentially more as you move to this eastern region from those very dry, arid landscapes of Ladakh. And it is those extremes in landscape, which I think fascinate me as a writer, fascinate anyone who has visited different parts of the Himalaya. Next, please. And we're talking here about Sikkim. Those images, the rhododendron came from the Gochila Valley in Western Sikkim. And there are many other species that have stories attached to them. The blood pheasant, which is considered a sacred species by the Lepcha people. And there are many myths and a lot of folklore attached to what I believe is called the Sumang Pho. It's a bird that led the people of that region away from the risks, the dangers of those floods, probably a flood very much like that one that devastated Kedarnath and the Mandakini Valley. The Sumang Pho led the Lepcha people to high ground and saved them from that destructive force of nature there. Next, please. Again, the stories are something that we draw upon as we move through the mountains. As you travel through the mountains, you meet people who tell you stories at different points. And as a writer, that's something that I collect because the mountains, as I said, are a reservoir of moisture. They're a reservoir of biodiversity. And because of that, they are a reservoir of stories. And just a very quick story from Bhutan that I was told. This is the yak, of course, an iconic Himalayan species. And when I was in Ladakh, in Bhutan, one of the people I met said, well, let me tell you a story about the yak. He said the yak and the buffalo decided to go into business. And the yak then persuaded the buffalo that I'm going to go up into the high mountains where it's very cold, so I need to borrow your coat. And the buffalo, being a trusting creature, gave his coat to the yak, and the yak went up into the mountains and he never came back. Next, please. And that is why the buffalo doesn't have any hair or very little hair, and why he looks at us with a very resentful look, because the yak has stolen his coat. So stories like that, folklore, very simple stories, also bring these creatures to life and give us another dimension to our observations and the way we look at them. This is a wild buffalo in Manas National Park in the Bhutan section of that park. An elderly old buffalo looking very resentful and certainly very naked without his coat. Next, please. The buffalo is remarkably an animal that is found in the Himalayas often, most often in its domesticated form. These are Gujar shepherds herding buffaloes up to the high meadows. You see these ungainly animals and you wonder, how on earth do they climb some of the slopes that they do? But they are remarkably adaptable. Next, please. We have to think not only of the mountains as a living landscape in terms of the biodiversity, but also an inhabited landscape where the people of the Himalaya also are part of the landscape itself. This is a small village in Uttarakhand looking up at Bandarpunch, villages that are built and survive in the presence of the high mountains. Next, please. And of course, out of that Himalayan location, out of those landscapes that are the cultural practices, the religious practices, the festivals, the pilgrimages that people undertake at different times of the year and at different seasons. This is, again, in Uttarakhand, not far from where I took the last picture at Agora village. There's the Nagadevta that is being celebrated, and people are dancing in celebration of the deity that is kept in the doli behind the drummer there. And it becomes this social gathering. It becomes a religious event, and it is also something that reaffirms, reenacts cultural practices and cultural beliefs in that way, all of which come out of that landscape in which that village is located. Next, please. Similarly, we have other rituals, other performances, other religious, cultural rituals that are performed in all different parts of the Himalaya. This, again, is Ladakh. I think at Shegompa, where during the winter there was a particular festival that was taking place. Next, please. You can see the masked dancers in their spectacular costumes, surrounded by people from the nearby community who gather to witness these particular festivals. Next, please. And many of the images, the masks themselves, are drawn from nature. This is a deer who performs along with some of the other iconic deities or demigods that are depicted in the mask dances. But again, very much a connection to nature, to the species that are found in the Himalaya. You can see that this was taking place in the dead of winter. Everybody is bundled up there. Next. And there are cultural practices that are much more contemporary. I love this slide. This was a sign, I think, a poster I saw in Darjeeling. So it's not just those wonderful traditional cultural practices, but there are very contemporary, very edgy, very modern images like this boy band from the Himalaya. So cultural practices are not restricted to one period of history or sometime in the past. It's happening today. And I love this image partly because look at the mountains behind, look at the prayer flags that are there, and look at the attitude of these 6 guys who obviously are expressing their own identity in the Himalaya today. Next, please. I'll very quickly go through these slides just because I'm running out of time here. But again, nature is part of our religious imagination, our cultural imagination. This is a temple in Jaunsar across the Yamuna from where I live, with all sorts of wild species depicted there. Next, please. This is a monal pheasant at the top of this particular shrine. So just as the blood pheasant is revered and recognized as an important species in Sikkim, so is the monal pheasant recognized and venerated here in Garhwal. Next, please. And I'll end with one quick folktale, which I've always found is an example of the way in which storytelling reflects not just cultural consciousness, but also in sometimes political consciousness as well. And it's a story that I've told many times. It comes from a book published back in the 30s by Taradat Gairola and E.H. Oakley called Himalayan Folklore. And I've adapted it over time as I've told it, but it's essentially about a bird that is found in the lower Himalaya. This is a common hill partridge, photographed just in my yard nearby a young common hill partridge. And the story very quickly and very briefly is that long ago, before independence, before the British, at the time of the Chand Rajas in Uttarakhand, in Kumaon, there was a little bird called the Pyora, which is the common hill partridge. And this bird would wander around the forest, picking at leaves, picking up seeds that had fallen on the ground, and it lived its life in a sort of carefree, natural environment. One day, as it was picking through the leaves, it picked up a coin, a sikka, a small, actually a pai, a copper coin worth 1 paisa at that time. And it began to sing, holding this coin in its beak, and it said, "I am richer than the king." And of course, news reached the palace, and the Raja, being a Raja, got very upset, and he told his finance minister, go and take the wealth from the Pura that is singing and saying that I am richer than the king. So the finance minister told his daroga, the daroga told the forest guard, and the forest guard went and snatched the coin from the Pura's beak. Now, the Pura wasn't bothered by that, and it kept on singing. It said, now it sang, the king is wealthy because of my wealth. The king is wealthy because of my wealth. And it kept singing this song. Now, the Raja, when he heard this in his palace, he was irate. Rajas don't get embarrassed very often, but he certainly felt as if the Pura was making fun of him. So he then told the finance minister, give that back. And the daroga gave the coin to the forest guard. The forest guard goes into the forest and returned that coin to the Pura. And then the Pura began to sing, I gave the king so much wealth that he couldn't spend it. I gave the king so much wealth and he couldn't spend it. And this story, a simple story, a story about nature, a story about a species like this, for me represents in many ways the wealth and abundance that is there in nature, in the Himalaya. And it's something that needs to be preserved. It needs to be revered and venerated, and it shouldn't be spent in all its totality. We must preserve that wealth that is there in the forests, just like the Pura is able to do in that way. So that next, and this will be the final slide. So thank you very much. I hope I haven't gone too much over my time, and I hope I've touched on some themes and ideas that will resonate in your own work and your own interpretation and inspiration that you find in the Himalaya. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Stephen. I think this was a really wonderful and incredibly illustrative talk, and that recharted in so many ways, I think, a landscape that we often struggle to visualize, simply because of its sheer expanse and the immensity that it holds. And I think for me, what stayed the most was the manner in which I think you rendered in such with such great gentility the richness of what it means to read the elements. And I think especially the kind of stories that these elements hold, and the fact that they hold so much history and so much memory. So before I launch into any questions, I think I'd like to invite and open up the floor to any questions, comments, anything that people might like to share. Please feel free to use the chat box in case you'd like to um, ask a question using your microphone. Please do use the raise hand option just so that we can keep a track of it. But yeah, would anyone like any questions?
More than a question, hi. Can I make a small confession to sir? So I am Kunal from Azim Print University, currently reading his book. And as of now, there are two students whose task is to take out extracts from the book related to the myths and the culture and the notes that Stephen Alter has made. And right now we have students doing the same. So it's very incidental that I'm very lucky that I managed to hear him. Thanks. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm sorry I generated homework for you. That's unfair, but I
Poor
hope you.
kids, yeah. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Matrika, yeah, you can go ahead with your question.
Yes. Hi, thank you so much for your talk. I am so inspired. I don't necessarily a particular question. I I love the stories that you shared, and I'm from Sikkim myself, and I call myself an aspiring storyteller because I feel like there's so many stories to share. So, Mr. Atler, are there any suggestions that you would give, like as somebody who is young and aspiring and just wants to put together the stories that you hear on an everyday basis? What is your method? And if there are any, I don't know, tips and suggestions that you could give on how do I build up those skills? Yeah, thank you.
Sure. Well, I think you will find many, many more stories than I have found. I can promise you, in terms of whether it's Sikkim, you probably already know many, many stories that I'm totally unaware of. But I think that one of the things is to look for stories in unexpected places too. We think of folklore as something that, you sit around a campfire and somebody suddenly tells a story, or your grandmother used to tell you a story at some time in the past, and then you recollect that, and it becomes part of your repertoire of stories in that way. But you will often find stories in places that are completely unexpected. You may be riding in a bus with somebody and they tell you a story, or you might see a name of a place that seems unusual, and you might ask somebody, why does this place have this name? I think one of the most important things that I've found over the years is when there's a name, ask, what does that mean? And sometimes people will be able to tell you, often they won't. But then you can explore on so many levels on that. And the last thing I'd say is that when you're collecting stories, don't feel that the stories that don't fit under the heading of folklore or mythology are any less than that. Stories from science are often as magical and inspiring as stories from cultural traditions, indigenous cultural traditions. So, and when you can put those together with the folklore, then you've got something really magical and something that will be entirely unique as a storyteller for you.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
I think there are questions in the chat. I'm not
Yeah, sure. Right. So, Suneet is asking, what are your questions? What are your thoughts and observations about the heavy road buildup in northern Garhwal to the Dham? Apparently, the railways are next. What have you been seeing here? And his second question is, could you briefly talk about the range that you see from Mussoorie, as it is something that he sees too from his home in Kanapal?
Yeah, well, the road building, when I wrote my book, Sacred Waters, which came out more than 20 years ago, I was walking along the pilgrim routes that lead to the Char Dham Yatra in Garhwal. And my objective really was to find sections of the old pilgrimage routes that people used to travel on foot, because in so many cases, the motor roads had covered over large sections of those paths. But I was able to find many of those original pilgrimage routes, particularly as they crossed laterally over the mountains. So from Gangotri to Kedarnath, there were long stretches that hadn't been covered over by motor roads. Now, 20 years later, many of those sections have been subsumed within the network of motor roads. So I wasn't particularly a fan of motor roads. Now, I have to say that if I was living in a village in a remote part of Garhwal, I would certainly want a motor road, because if someone gets sick, I can get to the hospital quickly, or if I need to bring supplies or go find work or whatever it is, the connectivity is important. So I don't want to dismiss the importance of motor roads, for the people's lives there. But I think what has disturbed me, and I think that it's something that needs more careful thought, is the creation of these main arteries, and we've all heard of it as roads, 4-lane roads going up to Badrinath and Gangotri and other pilgrimage sites, because it's all very well to build a 4-lane road, most of which is going to collapse in landslides during the next monsoon and will have to be rebuilt again and again. Fine, you can build those roads. It causes a lot of destruction. But the real point is there isn't enough space at a place like Gangotri or Kedarnath or Badrinath or Yamunotri, certainly, which is the only one that hasn't been fully connected by motor roads, for the volume of pilgrims that will then use that road. And I think that ultimately there's a hard truth in it that the government needs to be able to restrict the number of people that visit these shrines simply to preserve the experience of pilgrimage itself. Because the way it is now, you feel sometimes at Gangotri, you might as well be still standing on a crowded railway platform in Delhi rather than in the sacred solitude of the Himalaya. So the volume of people that these roads bring is sort of destroying the reason they're actually going there, which is that this is a sacred site, a beautiful site in the heart of the mountains. So I have to be careful. I don't want to certainly get in trouble by criticizing road construction, because it means something to villagers. But at the end of the day, these 4-lane roads, and certainly this railway, to be honest with you, we've seen the tunnel that collapsed near Uttakashi. There are going to be not dozens, but there are going to be hundreds of little tunnels that this railway line goes through. And what are we going to do when each one of those begins to collapse? It's a project that I don't think anyone has really thought through carefully enough. And at the end of it, I feel that the reason people come to the mountains is to see a landscape that is, to use a tired old phrase, unspoiled. And if you're simply going to spoil the landscape so that people can go there, you're defeating the purpose altogether. And the second part of your question, I'm an old man who forgets things, so I'll have to have a little help on that.
So the second question was, could you talk briefly about the range that you see from Mussoorie, as it's something that Sunit sees too from his home in Kanatal?
Right. And his home is in?
Kanatal.
Kanatal.
Karnatal. Okay, good. Yes.
Yeah.
We're both looking at the same set of mountains. You're about 25
50 kilometers
50. Okay, so 50
Yeah.
kilometers to our
by
right.
road.
Yeah. Well,
Right.
we're looking at, of course, that mountain range, which is the bulkhead of the Char Dham Yatra and some of the most sacred geography in the Himalaya. Sacred in the sense that it has numerous stories attached to each of those summits, whether it's Swargrohini off in the left, Bandarpunch in the foreground for me, to your left, and then, of course, the Gangotri group, Kedarnath, and Chowkhamba, and then off to the east, you can see on a clear day Dhunagiri and Nanda Devi. So you're seeing the entire range of the Garhwal Himalaya, the Uttarakhand Himalaya. And I always joke and tease my friends from Ranikhet or from other parts of the Himalaya that we have the best view of the Himalaya. Of course, they won't agree with me on that. They know, Kausani has the best view of Trishul and Nanda Devi and so on. But it is, to me, of course, it's sacred ground. And I mean sacred in the broadest sense of that. I'm not a believer on any level in terms of my own personal faith or lack of faith. But I do see that those mountains mean so much to so many different people. And the stories that are associated with each of these peaks, whether it's the Pandavas climbing Swaragrohini on their way to heaven, or Nanda Devi, the goddess who bestows bliss on her devotees. Each of those stories means something to so many people, and we have to recognize that they see those mountains with a set of eyes that are inspired by and informed by so many of these other folk tales and myths that give the mountains their significance and the power, in a sense, in our own imaginations.
Thank you, Mr. Alter. That was a great reply. I have one quick follow-up question, if you can hear me.
Sure.
There's been, between the Garhwali people and the Kumaon people, having lived in Garhwal in bits and bobs for 20 years, are the people different? Are they gentler? And are the Garhwal people more worldly wise, given the pilgrimage traffic that comes their way? That's why. Thank you again for an excellent chat.
Well, you're going to get me into trouble, because if I have to choose sides, I'm in big trouble on that.
You stay in Garhwal, sir.
I stay in Garhwal, but I go to Kumaon often, and some of my best friends are Kumaonis, so I have to be very careful.
Yes.
No, but
True,
I
sir.
think that I think what's important, and historians like Shekhar Pathak and others who have studied the region and written about it since the time of the creation of Uttarakhand as a state, but also looking back at history well before that, have a lot of interesting comparisons to make. I mean, one of the things, as I'm sure you know, Kumaon came under British administration after the Gurkha Wars, whereas Tiri and this part of Garhwal, where I live, remained under the Maharaja of Tiri. And so there are differences in that historical context there. I think people in Kumaon like to say that as a result of the British administration, the schools were better, and there was, they had access to certain facilities that the government provided. How true that is, I don't know, but I do get a sense that the educational system in Kumaon was certainly stronger than particularly the remote parts of Garhwal. So we can look at historical evidence in that way to make some of those comparisons. I think that culturally, linguistically, Garhwali and Kumaoni are quite different. You have to also think of the way in which Nepal itself, by invading this part of the mountains, imposed certain cultural practices and beliefs on both Kumaon and Garhwal, which are shared between the two. And then the opposition to the Nepali occupation by the people of Garhwal, as well as the people of Kumaon, who was complicit, who was opposed. All of that sort of thing has to be seen, not by me, because I'm not a historian, but I think historians of the region can interpret some of those cultural differences by looking at history and looking about the historical forces that occurred in that particular region. But at the end of the day, I like to think that the Nanda Devi story is perhaps the one that unifies Kumaon and Garhwal, because Nanda Devi lies pretty much on the border, or if you followed the border up, it would reach Nanda Devi. And so the people of Kumaon and the people of Garhwal look to her as the supreme goddess in their region of the Himalaya, and share that tradition. And the Nanda Devi Rajjat Yatra, though primarily in Garhwal, also is reflected in practices in Nainital and temples throughout Kumaon.
Thank you.
To kind of also just add one last question before we can close out the evening and not take up more of your time also, but because you spoke about because your talk has also looked so interestingly at sacrality and sacred landscape, I also just wanted to ask, what are ways in which writerly or creative practices, not to distinguish between the both, but to just make that distinction, what are ways in which practices can in some way try to find adaptable ways of I think recording and remembering the complexities of sacred landscapes. I think especially in a region like the Himalayas, but of course outside it too. But then to for the sake of this talk, to limit it to the Himalayas, like what would you think are some ways in which practices in the arts and the writing and the humanities could sort of respond, record, remember these landscapes?
Yeah, that's a good question, and I think that it's an important question because so much is changing, and I think it's important for people to scholars to be able to recognize some of the traditions that perhaps are fast disappearing. I think that my own sense of it is that you cannot focus on the main river valleys like the Bhagirathi Valley, the Alakananda Valley, because those have been to a very large extent co-opted by cultural and religious practices from the plains. But if you walk up the hill on either side of those valleys, and by that I mean many of the temples will have a very homogenized, and I don't mean that in a derogatory sense, but a familiar narrative of the various deities that are worshipped in those rites. But if you walk 10 kilometers up the hill on either side, you will encounter temples that are to local deities. You will encounter religious practices that are completely different from those in the main valleys where those 4-lane highways are going. And I think it's important for scholars to understand that you can't just sort of go to Rudraprayag and expect to find Garhwali culture in a sort of protected bubble. What you're going to find there is hundreds of years of pilgrims coming through telling their own stories, which have then co-opted what was there at that confluence originally. But as I say, if you can move away particularly from the motor roads, there's a whole lot happening there that is fascinating and needs to be preserved. And there are scholars. My good friend, Professor D.R. Purohit of Garhwal University is a wonderful folklorist, and he's collected so many traditions, traditional practices, from masked dances in the high mountains to the Pandav Leela celebrations that are found in the Mandakini Valley, which tell the stories that the Pandavas, and many of the stories that they tell are not the ones that you or I would find in a traditional rendition of the Mahabharata, but have a completely different localized tradition. And Professor Purohit has been able to identify those, document much of that, and preserve that. And so that's really, I mean, this is a long-winded answer to a question which I think really can simply be stated by get away from the pilgrimage routes and find culture in Garhwal and Kumaon as it exists in the villages beyond the scope of the pilgrimage routes.
Thank you so much. If there are no more questions or comments, we can proceed to wrap this up. In case there are, please do let me know.
Thank you so much, sir, for this beautiful, like story, all the stories that you shared and taken us through the landscape of the Himalayas. One question that was kind of stuck in my head throughout this presentation is, in your most of your sharing, I've noticed that you've shown us the petroglyphs and you've shown us these kind of like cave arts, like carved arts, which stone carved art which is kind of related to the biodiversity that is seen around us. And then towards the end, you also shared like a more contemporary kind of, aesthetic of the band of the boy band. So I was interested to know if you have felt in some way in these many years of you living in the Himalayas and working and telling stories of the Himalayas, have you seen a certain change in aesthetic that is clearly in a way like rooted in the change in biodiversity and the change in the like environmental or ecological landscape of the Himalayas? I was just kind of curious all throughout, so I thought I'd like to ask you.
Sure, thank you. Yeah, I mean, it's changing all the time, and the boy band is a good example of something contemporary. But I think if you look, for instance, at music in Garhwal, perhaps it's technology as much as anything that has changed some of those cultural practices. The cassette tape, which of course is something of the past. I mean, it's now an ancient artifact that none of us use cassette tapes anymore. But the way in which Garhwali music spread through the cassette tapes, which everyone was feeding into their, usually into a player in a bus or a taxi that was traveling through the mountains, suddenly the folk songs of Garhwal were reinterpreted with, of course, often with a Bollywood beat. There was a lot of sort of laying extra tracts on some of that music, and then reinterpreting it in a very contemporary way. So technology itself has changed that. Whether that's because of changes in the environment itself, I can't really say. But I think the important thing is that, yes, everything is changing. A lot of the music, for instance, in Garhwal, and again, Purohitji is much better at explaining these nuances than I am, but the way in which drumming has over time, drums have always been part of the repertoire of musicians who tell heroic legends and things through song. And the drum, the dhol, they speak of the dhol sagar, which is the sort of ocean of drumming in Garhwal, which is this enormous repertoire of legends and songs that are performed in villages throughout the region. All of that is in a sense being remixed. I mean, that's the only word I can say use. It's being remixed with adding soundtracks that sound more like a Bollywood soundtrack. And it's bound to happen. There's no reason it wouldn't happen. But what is interesting is that those traditions are still alive, and there are musicians that can still sing those stories in the traditional manner in that way. I don't know whether that answers your question. I know it doesn't answer the part about how the landscape has changed and it has affected the traditions. I guess the only thing I would say, I don't watch a lot of Garhwali films, but there is still a nostalgia for those lost landscapes, those beautiful meadows that are full of wildflowers, those high peaks that don't have a mobile tower in the foreground. All of those, that sort of nostalgia for a lost landscape is still very much alive in the Himalaya, and it's very much there in some of the films that are created and some of the music videos that are created today.
Very interesting. Thank you so much for sharing this, because I also see parallels of it happening here in Himachal. And like you said, I never noticed the music bit of it, the sound bit of it, but clearly in the aesthetic of how people even like do up their houses, and how people, even rituals have, the aesthetics of the rituals have changed a lot over time. And that is really interesting to like see as an artist. Well, thank you so much.
Thank you.
I think Rangdol, you have a question? In case you can hear us, you can use the chat box in case you're not being able to speak. Sure. So I think Moto has a question about if you've written a book or any article about Ladakh, and if you could share that.
Sure. I visited Ladakh a number of times, and both in Wild Himalaya, I have a couple of chapters about Ladakh in that book. And then in my most recent book, Wild Himalaya, The Cobra's Gaze, which is about wildlife, I spent 2 trips in Ladakh during winter looking for snow leopards, and I eventually saw the snow leopards, which you saw the images of. So yes, Ladakh is featured in several of my works. I visited Ladakh. The first time I visited was in 1981, before most of you were born. No, not 19. Yes, it was 1981. I'm sorry. And I went by motorcycle. Since Royal Enfield is sponsoring this event, I have to make a pitch for a bullet motorcycle, and I drove up to Ladakh via Kashmir, and that was a very memorable trip. And I've written about it in a couple of different articles and books as well.
The last question I'll take for the evening is by Nava, and they ask, what are the places to visit to explore Garhwal in respect to environmental justice?
Well, I think Garhwal, when you talk about environmental justice, and I think that the word that comes to mind immediately is Chipko, the Chipko movement from the 70s and early 80s. And if you're, again, I mentioned Shekhar Pathak, who's a historian from Kumaon, a very eminent authority on Himalayan culture as well as history. And he published a book about the Chipko movement about 2 years ago. And I would recommend reading his book. It has been translated into English. It was originally published in Hindi, and I'm going to forget the title, but I believe it's published in English. If you look up the Chipko movement and Shekhar Pathak, you'll find it very quickly online. And I think that retracing some of the significant sites that Shekhar speaks about, places where particular individuals, whether it's, Chandi Prasad Bhatt, who is one of the surviving veterans of the Chipko movement, has also just published his memoir or autobiography. So there are a lot of published sources, and then you could probably go up to the village of Raini, which is where the women first hugged the ash trees to protect them from the timber contractors who were going to turn them into hockey sticks. I don't know how much, I'm sure in that village, I've not been, but I'm sure you could hear the stories being told about the Chipko movement. And then in places like Nainital, and Shekhar, again, is one of the best sources for this. There are folk songs, there are songs that were sung, protest songs that were sung during the Chipko movement, and that then, in a sense, also become part of the movement for statehood in Uttarakhand. And those songs, I'm sure in a place like Nainital, there are people who remember those songs and still sing them. So I think you could wander through Uttarakhand talking about the Chipko movement or Sundarlal Bahuguna and the dam movement in Tiri, and there will be people who will tell you those stories again and again, and it's still very much alive in people's imagination.
With that, I'd like to also think we've had 2 hours, 2 wonderful hours of your time, and we're really, really grateful. It's been a really wonderful conversation, and I'm also really thankful to have everyone here. And we'll be very happy to continue this conversation with you, hopefully on another day. But thank you, everyone, and thank you first and foremost, Stephen. Thank you so much for your time. Yeah, thanks everyone for joining us today.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. My thanks to everyone.
Thank you.